At 4:51 a.m., the city of Seoul was doing what cities do in the hour before dawn. The Han River moved dark and flat between its banks. The elevated expressways were nearly empty. In the residential towers of Gangnam and Mapo and Nowon, 11 million people were sleeping, or almost sleeping, in the specific fragile quiet that exists between the last night owls and the first commuters. The air temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Low cloud cover pressed down over the city from the northwest, the kind of overcast that turns the orange glow of street lighting into a diffuse, directionless murk. In the underground command post of the Republic of Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff, buried beneath the hills south of the city, the Night Watch was monitoring the usual pattern of activity along the demilitarized zone, the occasional thermal signature of a North Korean patrol, the low-frequency acoustic noise of artillery tractors moving at the forward positions, the encrypted communications traffic that is never fully absent from the northern side of the line, and that trained analysts read the way a physician reads a pulse, not looking for activity, but listening for the specific change in rhythm that means something has shifted. Something had shifted at 4:47 a.m., 4 minutes before the first weapon fired. The shift had become unmistakable to the analysts, watching the take from the constellation of American and South Korean intelligence assets covering the Korean Peninsula. The thermal bloom signatures at 17 separate artillery positions along the forward edge of the North Korean deployment, positions that had been mapped, cataloged, and continuously monitored for years, had changed character simultaneously. Not the slow warm-up of a cold barrel being brought to operational temperature over hours of gentle firing. The fast, sharp thermal signature of systems being brought to immediate readiness from a stored condition. Simultaneously. 17 positions. The acoustic monitoring network registered the unmistakable sound of large-caliber artillery breach mechanisms cycling, of propellant charges being moved from storage to ready positions, of the specific mechanical preparation that precedes a mass fire mission. The watch officer reached for the communications panel. The decision chain moved at the speed it was designed to move. The pre-established protocols for this exact scenario, a detected mass artillery preparation along the DMZ, assessed as imminent against population centers, had been rehearsed until they were not decisions in the conventional sense, but actions, executed under authority already delegated to commanders who had been given it precisely so that the 17 seconds between detection and launch could not be compressed to zero by bureaucratic latency. The warning reached Combined Forces Command at 4:48 a.m. U.S. Forces Korea acknowledged at 4:48 a.m. and 11 seconds. The Korean Air Force's alert package at Osan Air Base was already taxiing at 4:49 a.m. At 4:51 a.m., the North Korean artillery commenced firing. What came off the forward positions in the first 60 seconds was not a demonstration. It was not a warning shot. It was a mass fire mission executed with the single purpose of putting the maximum possible weight of steel and explosive into the air simultaneously against the southern portion of the Seoul metropolitan area. 109 artillery pieces, a combination of 170mm Koksan self-propelled guns with ranges exceeding 30 miles, 240mm multiple launch rocket systems capable of covering target areas the size of city blocks with a single salvo, and a forward element of KN-25 super large caliber multiple rocket launchers firing 600mm rounds that carry warhead payloads equivalent to small tactical artillery shells, fired within a 90-second window. The sound of it, recorded by acoustic sensors along the DMZ, was described in the subsequent assessment as a continuous, overlapping detonation sequence rather than individual reports, the oral signature of a fire mission that had compressed the gap between rounds to its physical minimum. The rounds were in the air heading south at 4:51 a.m. and 40 seconds. Time of flight to the northern suburbs of Seoul, approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds for the faster systems, slightly longer for the heavier 600mm rockets. The KN-25 rockets, specifically, were the weapon that had caused the most concern in the targeting assessment compiled over the preceding months. Unlike conventional artillery shells, which follow ballistic arcs and can be engaged by counter-battery radar and close-in intercept systems with predictable geometry, the KN-25 series uses a guided terminal phase, a course correction capability built into the rocket's final seconds of flight that allows it to adjust trajectory and reduces the intercept geometry advantage that defending systems normally hold over unguided rounds. The North Koreans had positioned 24 KN-25 launchers in the forward element for exactly this reason. The guided terminal phase was their answer to the Patriot PAC-3 and Korean air and missile defense systems covering Seoul. In the tabletop planning that North Korean artillery staff had conducted over the preceding year, the guided terminal phase would degrade American and South Korean intercept probability sufficiently to allow a meaningful fraction of the KN-25 rounds to reach their designated target areas in the northern Seoul districts of Dobong and Nowon. The tabletop planning had not incorporated one critical variable. It had not incorporated what the American and South Korean missile defense architecture looked like after 18 months of deliberate capability investment specifically aimed at the KN-25 threat. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries covering the northern approaches to Seoul had been repositioned and augmented in a program that had begun in January of the previous year, when analysis of North Korean KN-25 testing data, gathered through a combination of radar tracking, signals intelligence, and imagery from overhead assets, had given American and South Korean engineers enough information about the terminal guidance system's correction algorithm to begin developing intercept profiles specifically tuned to that maneuver envelope. The result was not a new weapon. It was a new engagement sequence, a modified firing doctrine that timed the Patriot interceptor's own terminal guidance activation to account for the KN-25's predicted course correction, leading the target to where the guidance would take it rather than where it was when the interceptor launched. It had been validated in simulation against modeled KN-25 flight profiles. It had been rehearsed by the battery crews until it was procedural memory. It had never been tested against a live KN-25 in a real engagement. That test happened at 4:53 a.m. The doctrine worked. At 4:53 a.m. and 50 seconds, the first KN-25 rockets entered the engagement envelope of the Patriot batteries covering Dobong. The batteries fired on the modified doctrine. The first intercept was confirmed at 4:54 a.m. and 3 seconds. Then a second. Then, in rapid succession across the coverage arc, 14 more. The modified doctrine worked. Not perfectly. Nothing in missile defense works perfectly against a maneuvering target at this density and tempo, but with a single-shot kill probability high enough that the shoot-shoot doctrine, firing 2 interceptors per target, achieved a final intercept rate of 21 of the 24 KN-25 rockets in the northern Seoul sector. 3 KN-25 rounds survived to impact in the Dobong district. They struck in an area that had been designated as evacuation priority in the emergency protocols activated at 4:48 a.m., 5 minutes before the first rounds fired. The impacts caused structural damage to 3 residential buildings and a road overpass. The evacuation notification system, activated immediately on the detection of the mass artillery preparation, had driven the civilian population in the targeted areas into basement shelters in the 3 minutes between warning and impact. The structural damage was extensive. The human cost was a fraction of what it would have been against an unwarned, unprepared population. The conventional artillery, the 170mm Koksan shells, and the 240mm rockets that formed the mass of the fire mission were a different problem. Artillery shells at high volume are not the same threat calculus as ballistic missiles. They are faster in flight, lower in radar cross-section, and present at a density that overwhelms dedicated point defense systems. The KATBM Korean Air Defense Architecture, the Patriot PAC-2 batteries covering the broader Seoul area, and the American THAAD battery positioned south of the city were not designed to intercept conventional artillery at the rate of 100 rounds per minute. They were not expected to. The civilian and military infrastructure of the Seoul metropolitan area absorbs artillery attack the same way hardened military facilities absorb it, through dispersion, hardening, and the acceptance that a sustained mass fire mission will cause damage that cannot be intercepted its way out of. The hardened infrastructure survived. The dispersal protocols functioned. The damage to unprotected surface structures in the northern districts was real, significant, and painful. It was not, however, the catastrophic decapitation of the Seoul metropolitan area that the North Korean artillery plan had been designed to achieve. They had also made a second error, a profound one. They had assumed that the mass fire mission would compel the United States and South Korea to pause before responding, that the scale of the attack would generate a political paralysis, a desperate search for a ceasefire window that would give the North Korean artillery positions time to displace from their firing locations before retaliation arrived. In every historical precedent they had studied, the attacked party had required time to assess, to decide, to coordinate, to execute. Time was the commodity that artillery displacement doctrine is built on. Fire and move. You have minutes before the counter-battery response arrives. The counter-battery response had already left its launch points. At 4:49 a.m., 2 minutes before the North Korean artillery opened fire, and 1 minute after Combined Forces Command received the warning, the pre-delegated strike authority for the Korean Peninsula contingency plan had activated. The authority did not require a new decision at that moment. It required only the recognition that the triggering conditions, assessed imminent mass fire against population centers, had been met, and the release of the package that had been prepared, loaded, and positioned for exactly this scenario. 42 F-35A Lightning. 2 aircraft from the 8th Fighter Wing at Koksan Air Base had been in the air since 4:12 a.m., operating in a holding pattern over the Yellow Sea, under the cover of a training profile. They had not been on a training flight. They had been waiting. The B-1B Lancer package from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam had been airborne since midnight, refueled twice by KC-135 tankers over the Pacific, and was at this moment orbiting in a holding pattern over the East Sea, its weapons bays loaded with the targeting package for the North Korean artillery forward deployment, the command nodes that coordinated it, and the launch complexes for the KN-25 systems that had just fired on Seoul. The decision to pre-position these assets had been made 72 hours earlier, when the Space Force constellation had registered the first movement of KN-25 launcher vehicles from their garrison storage areas toward the forward deployment positions above the DMZ. That movement, tracked in real time, cross-referenced against signals intelligence showing a change in the communications pattern of the DPRK 4th Corps Artillery Headquarters, had been assessed as a pre-attack indicator of the highest confidence level. The pre-positioning had been executed without public announcement, under the routine operational tempo that shields specific capability dispositions from adversary awareness. When the North Korean artillery opened fire at 4:51 a.m., the aircraft that would answer were already in the air. At 4:50 a.m., 1 minute before the North Korean artillery fired, the B-1Bs turned northwest and began their attack run. They would reach weapons release range at 4:58 a.m. The North Korean forward artillery positions would complete their first fire mission at approximately 4:53 a.m. and begin the displacement sequence that their doctrine required. They would not complete that displacement before 4:58 a.m. The timeline had been calculated. The artillery displacement speed had been measured. The gap between firing and moving was known. The weapons release timeline had been designed to close that gap to zero. The EA-18G Growlers, assigned to the Electronic Warfare Suppression Mission, had departed Kadena Air Base in Okinawa at 3:40 a.m. 4 aircraft, their jamming suites configured for the North Korean Integrated Air Defense Network's primary operating frequencies, the S-band and X-band search radar systems that provided coverage of the approach corridors from the south and west, the VHF communications nets that connected the forward artillery command posts to the rear area fire direction centers, and the data link frequencies used by the KN-23 and KN-25 guidance systems to receive course correction commands in the terminal phase. The Growlers began their active jamming mission at 4:52 a.m., 1 minute into the North Korean fire mission, suppressing the communications infrastructure that the artillery forward command posts used to report battery status and receive displacement orders. The command posts knew they needed to move. They could not coordinate the movement through the communications system they depended on. They shifted to backup radio frequencies. The Growlers had been briefed on the backup frequencies. Those too dissolved into noise.
AGM-88 E-harm missiles addressed the North Korean early warning radars at 4:55 a.m. 6 radar sites covering the western approach corridor, the path the F-35A package would use, were rendered inoperable between 4:55 a.m. and 4:56 a.m. The North Korean air defense network in the forward sector was not blind in the sense of having no sensors remaining. It was blind in the operational sense of having no coherent picture to work from, no communications to coordinate a response through, and no remaining sensor capability that had not already been registered as a target in the American strike package.
The F-35As went in at 4:57 a.m., descending from altitude into the low-level attack profile that their threat environment required, each aircraft carrying a load of GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, precision-guided, highly accurate, with a collateral damage radius small enough to engage targets in complex terrain, and a complement of AGM-154. CJSOW glide munitions for the hardened artillery firing positions that required a larger warhead. The North Korean artillery positions were not hardened in the conventional sense. They were dispersed, camouflaged, and designed for rapid displacement, the physical characteristics of a force that has spent decades anticipating exactly this response. What they were not designed to survive was being acquired, tracked, and engaged before they had completed their displacement sequence. The Space Force overhead architecture had been tracking every artillery piece from its prepared position since 4:47 a.m. The thermal signatures of guns that had just fired are distinctive. Every piece that had participated in the 4:51 a.m. fire mission was a hot target with known coordinates.
17 artillery positions, 109 individual systems. The F-35A package addressed them position by position, each aircraft delivering its weapons load against pre-assigned aim points and then egressing on a southern route away from the remaining North Korean point defense systems. The engagement ran from 4:57 a.m. to 5:09 a.m., 12 minutes of systematic precision strikes against a force that had been designed to avoid exactly this outcome by moving before the response arrived, and had been prevented from moving by a communications jamming envelope and a strike timeline that had been compressed beyond the margin their displacement doctrine required.
The B-1Bs handled the command architecture, the fire direction centers, the rear area nodes that had coordinated the mass fire mission, that held the targeting data and the communications links to the forward positions, that represented the intellectual and operational infrastructure of the North Korean Artillery Corps in the forward deployment, were engaged by JASSM-ER cruise missiles beginning at 4:58 a.m. 14 command nodes, 14 JASSM-ER, each following a terrain-massed approach profile, each arriving at its designated target within a 40-second window of the first impact. The deeply buried primary command facility for the North Korean 4th Corps Artillery, which had overseen the fire mission from a hardened underground location designed to survive conventional attack, was addressed by two GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, released from a B-1B at 5:01 a.m. The first penetrated the facility's hardened overhead protection layer. The second, released 3 seconds later to follow through the channel created by the first, reached the facility's operational level before detonating. The seismic signature registered on monitoring networks in Seoul and Incheon. The facility was assessed as rendered inoperable in the post-strike analysis completed at 6:44 a.m. The KN-25 launcher vehicles, the systems whose guided terminal phase had been the North Korean planner's confidence weapon, were addressed by the F-35A package as a priority target set. All 24 KN-25 launchers had been tracked since their movement from storage positions to the forward deployment area 4 days earlier. Their positions had been updated continuously. At 4:57 a.m., when the F-35As began their attack runs, 21 of the 24 KN-25 launchers were still at their firing positions. The communications jamming had degraded the coordination of their displacement well enough that only 3 vehicles had managed to move before the strike arrived. All 3 were tracked on their displacement routes. All 3 were engaged by GBU-39 small-diameter bombs at 5:03 a.m., their positions updated by the Space Force constellation to within the weapon's accuracy margin. At 5:14 a.m., the strike package lead transmitted the preliminary battle damage assessment to Combined Forces Command. All assigned aim points engaged. 17 artillery positions struck. All KN-25 launcher vehicles assessed as rendered inoperable or total losses of asset. All 14 fire direction command nodes struck. Primary Artillery Corps command facility assessed as rendered inoperable. No American aircraft lost. No South Korean aircraft lost. No American personnel casualties. In Seoul, emergency services were working through the northern districts where the 3 surviving KN-25 rounds had impacted. The evacuation protocols had functioned. The structural damage was being assessed. The city's infrastructure, its power grid, its transportation network, its command and communication systems was intact and functioning. The North Korean Artillery Corps that had fired on Seoul at 4:51 a.m. no longer existed as a functional military formation in the forward deployment area. It had been built over decades. It had been maintained at enormous cost by a government that had prioritized it above almost every other claim on the country's resources, because it was the primary instrument of deterrence against exactly the kind of response that had just been executed. It had fired once. The response had been faster, more precise, and more comprehensive than anything their doctrine had prepared them to survive. In the northern districts of Seoul, the streets were beginning to fill with emergency vehicles and the cautious emergence of residents from basement shelters. The damage was visible. The city was standing. 11 million people were alive and in a functioning city, in a country whose military command structure had not been disrupted and whose air force was already repositioning for the follow-on operational cycle. The message written in the mathematics of the preceding 23 minutes was not ambiguous. It was not open to interpretation. It was the definitive answer to a question that the Korean Peninsula had lived with for 70 years. Written in the language of precision strike and intercepted warheads and a timeline compressed so tight that there had been no gap between the decision to attack and the decision to eliminate the capacity to attack again. In war, speed is not an advantage. Speed, at this level, is the entire argument.